Imagine you are walking down a street in Moscow in 1933. You are a student, a worker, or maybe just someone who forgot their internal passport at home. Suddenly, a black car pulls up. You are detained, processed as a declassed element, and within days you are packed into a wooden barge with 6,000 other surplus people. You think you are being sent to build a new life in Siberia. But the reality is much simpler. You are being sent to a place where the Soviet government wants to see how long a human can last on nothing but air and river water. Welcome to Nazino Island, a tiny strip of land in the middle of the Ob River, swampy, mosquito-infested, and completely uninhabited. In the West, we have reality shows like Survivor, where people compete for $1 million. In 1933, the Soviet Union ran a version where the only prize was living to see the next sunrise, and unlike TV, there were no camera crews to step in when things got ugly. By the time the barges reached the island in May, the colonists were already dying. They had been given almost no food during the weeks-long transit. When they were finally dumped on the shore of Nazino, there were no barracks, no tools, and no supplies. Just the cold Siberian wind and the guards, who were often more terrified of the situation than the prisoners themselves. The first thing the authorities did was distribute the only resource they had, flour. But there were no ovens, no pans, and no firewood. Imagine being given a bag of raw flour while standing in a swamp. People began to mix the flour with river water in their hats or even their shoes, eating the raw paste just to stop the cramping in their stomachs. In modern terms, it's the ultimate low-carb diet, except the side effect isn't weight loss. It's a painful, slow shutdown of your internal organs. Within 3 days, the first bodies began to pile up. The guards, poorly trained and prone to panic, began to use their rifles to maintain order during flour distribution, shooting into the hungry crowds. But the real threat wasn't the bullets. It was the hunger that turns a person into something else. By the end of the first week, Nazino Island earned its permanent nickname in history, Cannibal Island. When you strip away civilization, when you take away every tool and every scrap of dignity, what is left of the human soul? On Nazino, the answer was terrifying. Reports from the time, later hidden in the deepest Soviet archives, describe scenes that would make a horror movie director blush. People were hunted like animals by their fellow prisoners. It wasn't just about survival, it was about the total collapse of the social contract. The guards stayed on the mainland, watching through binoculars as the island turned into a localized version of hell. They were forbidden from helping, only allowed to shoot anyone who tried to swim across the freezing river to escape. In the eyes of the state, these 6,000 people weren't citizens. They were an experiment in social engineering that had gone horribly, predictably wrong. Compare this to the way we view disposable people today. We talk about cancel culture or deplatforming, but in 1933, the ultimate unfollow button was a one-way ticket to a swamp in the middle of nowhere. The Soviet state didn't just want you gone. They wanted you erased from the ledger of humanity. The distribution of food on Nazino was not an act of mercy. It was a spark in a powder keg. Imagine 4 tons of rye flour dumped onto the shore for thousands of starving people. There are no scales, no bags, and no oversight. The guards, fearing for their lives, stayed on the perimeter, occasionally firing their Mosin Nagant rifles into the air or into the crowd just to keep the desperate masses from rushing the barges. When you finally got your handful of flour, you faced a brutal physical reality. If you ate it dry, the flour would suck the moisture from your throat, making it impossible to breathe. If you tried to mix it with the river water, you ended up with a gray, gritty paste that carried the bacteria of the swamp. Dysentery hit the island within 48 hours. Now, imagine thousands of people with severe intestinal infections, no toilets, no medicine, and no clean water. The island didn't just smell like death. It smelled like the total collapse of human biology. But the flour also created a new social hierarchy. In every group of people, predators emerge. Gangs of hardened criminals who had been mixed in with the innocent passportless workers began to hoard the flour. They became the kings of the mud. If you wanted to eat, you had to pay. But what do you have to give when you possess nothing? On Nazino, the only currency left was your body or your life. By the second week, the socialist experiment had devolved into something prehistoric. The thin veneer of Soviet comradeship evaporated under the Siberian sun. People began to huddle in small tribes for protection, but even then, trust was a death sentence. You would go to sleep next to a friend and wake up to find them gone, or worse, wake up to find them looking at you as if you were a side of beef. The guards' behavior was equally disturbing. Many of these men were young recruits from local villages, barely older than the people they were starving. They were given strict orders. No one leaves the island. When prisoners tried to build makeshift rafts out of driftwood and willow branches, the guards hunted them like sport. If a raft managed to float into the current, the guards would open fire from their motorboats, watching as the desperate colonists disappeared into the freezing gray water of the Obe. There is a dark irony here that resonates with our modern world. We live in an era of managed systems and optimized logistics, but Nazino shows us what happens when the logistics are designed for disposal rather than delivery. The Soviet bureaucracy was incredibly efficient at arresting people and transporting them thousands of miles, but it forgot the most basic human requirement: a spoon, a fire, and a roof. It wasn't an accident. It was a structural indifference to human life that makes modern corporate negligence look like a minor clerical error. As the death toll climbed to 30, 40, then 100 people a day, the island began to change physically. The ground, soft and marshy, couldn't hold the weight of the dead. Shallow graves were washed away by the tide, leaving limbs and torsos exposed to the elements. It was a landscape of bones and burlap, a place where the air was thick with the hum of millions of mosquitoes feeding on the living and the dead alike. In the middle of this nightmare, the predators began to realize that the flour wasn't enough to keep them strong. They needed protein. And that is when the most whispered about chapter of the Nazino incident began: the systematic hunting of the weak for meat. By the middle of the second week, the human form on Nazino Island began to blur. Starvation is not just a lack of calories, it is a physiological rewiring. When the body runs out of fat and muscle, it begins to consume the brain's gray matter. On Nazino, this manifested as a mass psychotic break. The predators, largely the hardened criminals who had seized control of the flour, no longer saw their fellow inmates as people. They saw them as a resource. The first recorded acts of cannibalism were born of absolute desperation, but it quickly evolved into a terrifyingly organized hunt. The gangs began to target the weakest members, the elderly, the sick, and the women. Historical witness accounts from the local villagers, who watched from across the river, describe scenes of people tied to trees, their muscles harvested while they were still breathing because there was no way to preserve the meat in the humid swamp. This wasn't just a breakdown of law, it was a breakdown of the species. In modern horror movies, we see zombies or monsters, but on Nazino, the monsters wore Soviet caps and spoke about the bright future of socialism while chewing on human remains. The guards, standing on the mainland, were fully aware of what was happening. They reported unusual activities on the island, but the bureaucracy was so paralyzed that no one wanted to take responsibility for stopping the nightmare they had created. Why didn't the guards intervene? To understand Nazino, you have to understand the Soviet quota system. The officials in charge of the deportation had a target. They had to relocate a specific number of people to Siberia to tame the wilderness. Once those people were checked off the list and dumped on the island, their survival was no longer a metric for success. They were, quite literally, off the books. The guards were instructed to treat the island as a quarantine zone. Anyone attempting to swim to the mainland was shot on sight, their bodies left to float downstream as a warning to others. We live in a world today where we worry about algorithmic bias or systemic exclusion, but Nazino was a system that worked exactly as it was intended to. It removed the unwanted from society and let the environment finish the job. By late May, the island was a landscape of bones, raw flour, and madness. Of the original 6,000 people, nearly 2,000 were dead or missing. The survivors were ghosts, skeletons wrapped in rags, their teeth falling out from scurvy, their skin covered in infected mosquito bites. When the authorities finally realized that the experiment was a total disaster and decided to move the survivors to other camps, they found that many could no longer even stand up. They had to be dragged onto the barges like sacks of grain. The only reason we know the full extent of this horror is because of a man named Vasily Velichko. He was a local party instructor who was so sickened by what he saw that he did something incredibly dangerous. He wrote a detailed 11-page report directly to Joseph Stalin. Velichko described the cannibalism, the rotting piles of bodies, and the sheer incompetence of the planners. He wrote about how people were arrested for not having a passport while they were out buying a loaf of bread, only to end up on Cannibal Island 2 weeks later. In the Soviet Union of 1933, this was essentially a suicide note. To criticize the deportation system was to criticize the state itself. Surprisingly, Stalin actually read the report. But he didn't stop the deportations because he was moved by the suffering. He stopped them because the report proved the system was inefficient. The human resources weren't being used to build the Siberian infrastructure, they were just being wasted in a swamp. Velichko was eventually fired, and the report was buried in the special files of the Kremlin, stamped with the highest level of secrecy. It stayed there for over 50 years, a ghost in the machine of history. By June 1933, the experiment was officially declared a failure, but the Soviet state had a new problem: how to make an island of corpses disappear. The survivors were evacuated to other labor camps deeper in the taiga, many dying on the journey from sheer exhaustion or the infections they contracted on the island, but the bodies remained. The cleanup crews were sent in not to honor the dead, but to sanitize the record. They burned what they could and buried the rest in mass pits, trying to level the earth so the swamp would swallow the evidence. For decades, if you traveled past Nazino on the Obi River, you would see nothing but a lush green island. The silence was so complete that even the local villagers were warned that talking about the cannibals would earn them a spot on the next barge. This is the original shadow ban. Long before social media algorithms could suppress information, the Soviet state used the literal shadow of the Siberian forest to delete an entire event from human memory. They didn't just kill the people, they tried to kill the fact that they ever existed. It wasn't until the late 1980s, during the era of Glasnost, that the special files were opened and the ghosts of Nazino were finally allowed to speak. When historians finally reached the local villages in the late 20th century, they found that the memory of Nazino hadn't vanished. It had turned into folklore. One elderly woman, who had been a child at the time, recalled seeing a woman from the island whose calves had been cut away while she was alive. The woman asked the girl, "Is there any bread in the world?" These testimonies reveal a level of trauma that numbers on a spreadsheet can never capture. It wasn't just about the hunger, it was about the betrayal of the very idea of a worker's paradise. These people had been told they were the masters of the new world, yet they were treated as less than the mosquitoes that fed on them. In the Soviet system, the individual was a rounding error. If you lose 6,000 people to prove a point about logistics, that is considered a learning opportunity for the party. You might think that Nazino is a relic of a dead ideology, a horror story from a century ago, but the logic of Cannibal Island lives on in every system that treats human beings as disposable data points. When we see modern bureaucracies offshoring labor to places where there are no safety laws, or when we see populations displaced by economic restructuring and left to fend for themselves in temporary camps, we are seeing the same DNA. The Soviet planners didn't hate the people on Nazino, they simply didn't care about them. And that indifference is the most dangerous force on Earth. We live in a world of smart cities and seamless logistics, but Nazino reminds us that when the system breaks, it breaks on the bodies of the most vulnerable. The Cannibal Island isn't just a place in Siberia. It's a state of mind where the spreadsheet is more real than the person. The story of Nazino ends as it began, in silence. Today, the island is once again a quiet strip of land in the middle of a gray river. There are no monuments, no museums, and no tours. Only the water of the Obi continues to flow past, carrying the secrets of 1933 into the Arctic Sea. But we remember because once you hear the story of the man who traded his life for a handful of raw flour, or the woman who was hunted like a deer, you can never look at progress the same way again. The iron gates of the Soviet past are open, and the truth is out.